Good evening and welcome to this Think Tank event, hosted by the Liberal Conservative think tank Bright Blue. I'm Phoebe Arsenagic-Wakefield, researcher at Bright Blue, and joining us today is Laura Farris MP to speak on the topic, Where Are We Now? Ending Violence Against Women and Girls. A barrister specialising in equality and employment law, Laura has represented Newbury since 2019. She sits on the Home Affairs Select Committee and is co-chair of the Women and Work APPG. Laura, welcome. Would you like to start?
Thank you so much, Phoebe, and thank you to everybody who's joined this call tonight, because I was sort of thinking it's quite an ask on a sort of, nice spring, May evening when the pubs have just opened to sit around with the Tory MP talking about sexual violence. But actually, it's a really, really important moment to be having this conversation, because tomorrow there's an urgent question in the chamber on basically asking whether or not the government has legalised rape, and that's obviously that's the way it's put by the opposition, and that's a fairly shocking question in itself. But it, I guess, kind of garners our thoughts as to where we are on the issue of sexual violence against women, what the government has achieved, and why the issue of rape remains such a problematic one. And one where I have to say the rate of conviction is shockingly low. So if I could start, I think, by talking about some of the things that the government has done on sexual violence against women. And I think one of the things that people often don't really associate the Conservative Party with is, in fact, doing anything on sexual violence against women. I don't think we have a sort of reputation at all, and it's quite important to string together some of the things that have happened in the last 10 years, because they have actually changed the terrain, and some of them I was involved in a little bit, and so I'll kind of just go through them as they arose. One of the, I think, most important things the government did about 5 or 6 years ago was look again at domestic abuse, and it created the new offence of coercive control, which you may have heard about, that form of sort of degrading, very manipulative behaviour that can occur in relationships, obviously often going hand in hand with sexual violence too. And that was the offence that led, for example, to quashing the conviction of Sally Challen, who was serving a life sentence for the murder of her husband, when she was convicted at a time when, unless your husband basically punched you in the face, there wasn't a recognised form of domestic abuse that could exist outside pure sexual physical violence. They've also outlawed upskirting, which was the practice that was sort of gaining traction at festivals and in public places, of people putting a camera or a phone under a girl's skirt. They created the offence of stalking. Previously, that was dealt with under the Protection from Harassment Act. They've doubled the sentence, the maximum sentence for stalking. They've looked at some of the more sort of modern sexual behaviours that happen. So, for example, they've criminalised revenge porn, which was a serious form of sexual abuse. In fact, they went further than that in the domestic abuse bill that's just passed and received royal assent, and they criminalised the threat of revenge porn, because they accepted the testimonies of some women who said how completely destructive to their lives the idea that somebody who'd either been a partner, who'd usually been a partner, would seek to destroy them because they held on to images, and whether or not they actually had those images, sometimes the women didn't know. The threat was enough to have a completely catastrophic effect on their life and on their confidence. They also put into statute outlawing the rough sex defence, which was a defence that was sometimes asserted in cases of serious sexual harm or rape, or at worst murder, where the man said, I was only doing what she wanted me to do. It went wrong on that occasion, but if it hadn't been for her, and it hadn't been for her tastes, none of this would have happened. And there was a particularly stark example of a case, and the case of Natalie Connolly, where the bloke who killed her and then left her in a pool of blood for about 9 hours naked at the bottom of a staircase in his house went down for 18 months for manslaughter. He's now out. And he argued that he only did the things he did because she asked him to. The CPS started off by pursuing a murder charge, changed it to manslaughter. He pleaded guilty to manslaughter. And when you read the sentencing remarks, you can find them online, actually. It's R.V. Broadhurst. You can just find it on Google. It is really shocking to see the judge accepting his account of the night, that everything that happened, some of which was extraordinarily violent, at a moment when she was very close to death, was all her instigation, and he was the reluctant partner rather than the perpetrator. So that was outlawed in the Domestic Abuse Bill. They also passed the Modern Slavery Act, and we tend to, that was Theresa May's bill, I think some of you may know, and I think we often talk about modern slavery in quite a kind of vague way without being specific as to what it means. But in the case of women, by and large, it means being trafficked into the UK and either working as a prostitute in some disgusting brothel where you haven't got a passport and you have no right to escape, or sometimes it's also working in the kind of ring of nail bars too. But basically, it is a life of absolute misery and servitude, and the Modern Slavery Act goes some way to deal with that. They've also actually, and you might again dimly recall the work that William Hague did with Angelina Jolie, which hasn't sort of had as much traction as it once did. But do you remember they did the campaign about tackling rape as a weapon of war? They raised a huge amount of awareness on that. I think there's further to go, but I think the US and the UK were the first two countries to really seriously talk about that, and still the government actually is giving a lot of support to UNITAD, who investigates those crimes, for example in Iraq where they occurred, and in Syria where they occurred against the Yazidi women. They've also got, you know, they've had a few really important campaigns in the last year, partly as a consequence of the pandemic. They got, I mean, I think they've kind of tripled the amount of money they spend on refuge spaces for women who were caught in, you know, domestic violence. And actually, in the last year, there were some really kind of powerful campaigns that were launched to protect women. So they worked in conjunction with some of the rail operators. And if you were leaving a house during lockdown, not only could you go to the train station, but if you'd made contact with a refuge anywhere in the UK, all the main train operators would let, as long as you could prove that with a text message on your phone, all the main train operators who had worked with the government would then let you travel for free, also with your kids. They had a scheme called Ask for Annie, which was sort of circulated on social media, where a huge number of Boots chemists in the UK, you'll recall the time when you could only go out to shop, they had a system in place at pharmacies that if you went up to the counter and asked for Annie, that would be recognised as somebody who needed immediate support, and people were rescued from abusive situations that way. And then finally, they've also been kind of keeping in the spotlight historic sexual offences that have happened where women might have given up in the past, with a campaign that's been going actually about 3 or 4 months now. The hashtag is It Still Matters, but it's part of a concerted piece of work that the MOJ is doing with the Home Office and the police, where people are being encouraged not to forget about things that might have happened to them if they're previous offences. And so I think, rather than just giving you a shopping list of things, I think one of the things that I would say is that the government is very focused on sexual violence against women, and it has thought creatively about how to tackle that. And one of the things that was quite striking about the Domestic Abuse Bill, and if any of you are sort of as sad as me and ever read the Hansard transcript of bill committees, you'll see that when the bill went to committee, there was sort of a bit of an argument about this, which was whether the Domestic Abuse Act should just really cater to people who were in long-term stable relationships, which is how we might understand it, or whether it should deal with people who were in, you know, in the context of a kind of Tinder hookup and the kind of violence that arose there. And they took the second option. And so the person who suffers choking during sex that might happen then is a kind of modern trend. Now that's now been made into an offence. It's called the offence of non-fatal strangulation, which I find such a kind of sanitized way of describing something that I think happens with increasing frequency, and certainly the campaign groups that contacted me said that. Again, the rough sex offence being something that came up a lot, the idea that it was some consensual thing that may have gone wrong. And usually actually the outcome of that was that the CPS would either not not charge, or if they did charge, would go for a lower level offence on the basis that the jury would accept that the defendant said it was all consensual along the way, even if she denied it. And then finally, all the stuff about revenge porn was much more likely to occur in casual kind of relationships than it was necessarily, not always, but in the more serious ones. And so I think one of the things, and I don't know if this message landed as strongly as I think it ought to have done, but it really created a suite of protections for women, you know, who are part of hookup culture. And we have to be realistic about the way particularly young women live and the kind of things that they encounter. And I was sort of really proud of the government, and I was one of the people who campaigned on some of this, for sort of grasping the nettle, because I think often politicians can be a bit embarrassed to accept what's right in front of their nose, even, you know. And I think there was really impressive engagement between places like the Centre for Women's Justice, particularly them actually, and other young women who came forward and gave their stories, and the willingness of the government to kind of create a kind of package of laws that would protect them now and in the future, and to realise that. But I think I couldn't really kind of complete this presentation without talking a little bit about the law, the law around rape and rape conviction rates, because they've hit the headlines for good reason. And it is true, just to put the figure starkly, that rape convictions are the lowest I think that they've ever been. And I looked at an article when I was preparing for this, and it looks as if, I mean, just to give you one statistic, between sort of the year 2016 to 2017 and now 20 to 21, there has been a 70% fall in the number of rapes that end up in conviction. And the government is publishing an end-to-end rape review, which was due in late spring and is now coming out in June. And there's a challenge from the other side as to whether or not it's taken too long with the rape review, and whether the rape review is going to go far enough. So I thought for this part of my talk, I would actually just throw out some ideas, and anyone who has a question or something they'd like to kind of ask about, or some thoughts, I'd be interested to hear from, because actually, as I think it was said at the beginning, that I sit on the Home Affairs Select Committee, and we're about to do a big inquiry on this issue, on rape convictions particularly, but also on sexual violence against women. And I know that I'll hear stuff then, I think it's beginning next week actually, or in 2 weeks, I'll hear stuff then which will kind of take my understanding further. But I think it's worth me setting the contours of the issue in a way that's accurate, because I think sometimes it's not kind of commonly understood. And as I said, I'll take any questions or any ideas that you may have. I think the first issue about rape is the context in which it occurs. And you may know this, I didn't know it until I started doing criminal law at law school. I was a barrister before, not a criminal barrister, but I did some criminal law at law school. The majority of rapes that take place are not the stranger in the park, or the guy following a random woman home late at night. Most people are raped by somebody they know. I'll go further than that. Most people will be raped by somebody that they might be in a semi kind of situation with. Nowadays, maybe somebody they've met online, maybe somebody they have already had a relationship with, but most rapes take place behind closed doors, you know, in private, where two people are present, and let's be honest, probably both people have had a few drinks. I just say that to set the context, but to kind of draw it back down to juries. When juries are confronted with, you know, the woman walking home late at night through a park who gets raped by a stranger, they usually have no problem in convicting. The challenge in cases like that is finding the perpetrator in the first place, because, you know, because of the nature of it, and it's just a guy in a balaclava who may or may not get away with it. When it happens behind closed doors, that has always been a problem. And I was talking to a colleague, a parliamentary colleague of mine, before this talk tonight, and he was a criminal barrister, and he said to me, you know, there was never a golden age of rape. It's always been harder to get a conviction for rape than it has been for almost any other crime. And that's because when you reduce it to what's there, it's nearly always he said, she said, with no witnesses. And when I was young, you know, I think when I was at university about 20 years ago, one of the issues there would be juries forming a sort of judgmental view of maybe the way the woman was dressed. You know, there was lots of kind of student stuff, not concerning me or my university, but I remember those sorts of stories, how the girl was dressed, whether she was drunk, how she, you know, what her sexual history was. Now, we've come a long way from there. Sexual history isn't in it anymore. But now it is often an online hookup. There is often a text message somewhere along the line which suggests some sort of enthusiasm, certainly for meeting up that evening. And often the context in which the people have gone back to the place where it happens has not been, you know, resisted. And I sort of tried to find out a bit more about what people felt was going on, and I was told that one of the things that's happening a lot is people they go to the police and report the rape, but somewhere between reporting and trial they drop it. The other thing that I've heard is that there can be issues in the way that the police and the CPS liaise and the exchange of information. I think it is probably right to say that there is still an issue with juries. They have to convict beyond reasonable doubt. Now that's just 3 words, but really it's usually taken to mean about a 90% likelihood. And you can imagine what the defense is a lot of the time. You know, I thought she liked me, we'd met before, we went back, I didn't, you know, she seemed up for it, she regretted it the next morning, so she bought this, or I misunderstood her signals because we were both completely drunk. They've got to find that the man intended to do it. And if they don't find that, then he's acquitted. And I do think that happens too. But as I say, I would welcome kind of input from other people on this. And I think I'll be kind of learning more over the months ahead. But the end-to-end rape review, when it is published, is going to be an absolutely critical, you know, a critical piece of work from the Home Office, because, or I think it's from the MOJ and the Attorney General's Department as well. Because the truth of the matter is that rape convictions are very, very low in this country, and something is going wrong. And it seems to me that it's a really critical part of the kind of jigsaw for us to tackle as politicians and as thinkers. And I actually prefer to depoliticize it because, you know, as with everything in politics, it can be kind of one side or the other. As I say, my whole life there's been a problem with rape convictions. It was, you know, it always did badly, now it's doing worse, and the question really is why. And I think with that I will close, Phoebe, and let you ask me some questions, or anyone else who's part of this who'd like to ask.
Fantastic, thank you, Laura. Yeah, so just I guess following on from the point you've just made, as you've been saying, rape convictions, they're at a record low. The proportion of victims withdrawing from prosecutions, which you spoke about, I think has now doubled in the past 5 years. I think now it's at 40%, which is very high. You've referenced tomorrow's urgent question. There was obviously a public outpouring of grief and rage in the wake of Sarah Everard's murder. How can we begin to restore public confidence in the systems that are in place to keep us all safe, including the criminal justice system?
Yeah, I'd like to address the Sarah Everard issue separately, actually. I think that's because that was a kind of, you know, that was a huge moment and a national shock, and it precipitated a conversation. But I think part of that conversation was about the sort of the absolute outrage of a woman doing something that basically every adult woman has done in their life, and being found a week later in a, you know, halfway across the country murdered. And the sort of, and I think everybody imagining the trajectory that got her there, it was such a sort of stark and shocking example of the most horrific form of violence against a person. But I think that when we talk about rape, and I said a bit earlier in my speech that a lot of rape happens behind closed doors of people who already know each other, and I define know quite loosely. You know, it may well be people who've only just sort of interacted a little bit on a dating site. But I suppose the kind of thinking that I am beginning to have is whether or not we need to have a more dedicated service for this, with people who both in the police, both in the CPS and whether or not, and I raised this and I sort of got it batted back, and I don't know whether I'm right or wrong on this, but even possibly having, if not specialist juries who deal with rape, having judges who give specific directions in relation to rape. So having almost like judges who do a lot of rape and can contextualize the evidence a bit for the jury. Because I do think that the sort of whole culture of phones and messaging can be basically fatal. I think possibly, I think people fear, you know, their phone being taken from them. If it's not the messages they sent to that person, maybe it's to someone else, something about their general behavior, something about the way that they're going to feel so exposed and violated again, I think makes it, I think might go some way to explaining why people pull out of these serious crimes. And obviously the ramifications, by the way, are incredibly serious, because where there is a genuine perpetrator, they're free to reoffend, and they think they more or less got away with it because they did. So my view, I think, is that we need to have a lot more training around phones and phone evidence. You know, the fact a few flirty texts have been sent is not that should not be fatal to a woman's case. Obviously we have to balance everything carefully, but that, and also I do think I'm kind of beginning to move towards perhaps more specificity in the way it's dealt with as a crime, in terms of the judges, in terms of the police, and in terms of the CPS.
Thank you, Laura. We have a audience question, which is, do you think that the government should legislate on sexual harassment? Which also leads into, I think, connected to a question I want to ask you, because I know you've been working with Our Streets Now, in terms of street harassment. I think you're exploring legislation as a way forward there. So would you like to speak about that?
But that's a really good question. And I think it's been raised in a very sort of articulate and persuasive way by the young women who are part of Our Streets Now, and I think they make two or three really compelling arguments, actually. The first is that you know, the tendency, I think, with street harassment to kind of, you know, say, oh, it's just as old as the hills, you know, it's just a wolf whistle, you should feel flattered, love, you know. But we all know, and I think particularly schoolgirls have this experience, actually, that often it's a hell of a lot cruder than that, and it's basically a violation. And Mayor Tutton, who is one of the young women on Our Streets Now, was talking about some of the stuff I think that got said to her and her sister, and I'm not sure how old she is, but she's a very young woman. Really sort of explicit stuff that had kind of motivated her to start the campaign. And she said to me, you get more for littering. And you do, actually, and it's whether or not you should be able to scream such obscenities to a young woman. And I think the other thing that is relevant about the way they put their campaign is that a lot of the worst kind of, you know, like, of course, like the vast majority of men do not behave in this way, but when they do, there's often been cumulative conduct, which starts by being massively disrespectful to women. And if that's just yelling out of a van something really explicit to a young girl and getting a laugh and her looking shocked, that can be the kind of behavior that escalates to maybe behavior in a bar, behavior with a group, and so on. And I do think that there's a really kind of compelling argument for looking at the lower level stuff and accepting that it can be a gateway. The only thing I would say, and I think I've told them this, and I think it's the challenge for politicians, is creating an offence in such a way that we don't kind of overplay our hand, and so that, you know, I don't know, that you end up trying to involve the police in a guy who wolf whistles somebody walking past. And that's been the case with I mean, actually, it's the same with sexual harassment at work. Not every single sexually slanted remark that's made at work amounts to sexual harassment. The Equality Act requires you to take into account context in order to make that determination. And we'd have to find an equivalent route through the criminal law. So I think with that caveat about not making it so low that even the smallest thing would count, I do think they make a compelling case, actually, and I know that the Home Secretary has met with them and is looking at it really carefully.
Thank you, Laura. I mean, just sort of touching, I guess, on the workplace harassment thing a bit more. I mean, I think figures are really unclear, but we know that somewhere from 25% to 80% of women, which is obviously a huge range, report experiencing sexual harassment in the workplace. It's obviously not only the street that is the issue. Why do you think harassment is so endemic in sort of all the spaces that women find themselves in? And surely that indicates that there's a profound cultural change rather than legal change that also needs to take place. And how can we even go about doing that?
That's a good question. I did used to work on some of these sorts of cases when I was a barrister. And I saw everything actually, from the case that didn't succeed at all because it was maybe not being brought in a completely genuine spirit, to ones that really shocked me and actually were so close to criminality that it seemed weird that it was going through the employment tribunal rather than the criminal courts. I think that workplace culture has a lot to do with it. And some workplaces are better than others. And typically a more sort of progressive workplace is less likely to have it. I think another reason for it a bit historically, so when I started off as an employment lawyer in 2007, there was still a big, so I did loads of London work, there was still a big city culture. I often would be involved in banking cases where like a group of traders would have wanted to go to a strip bar with the client. And whatever the women in the team experienced, whether that was direct sexual harassment or just being put into a deeply humiliating environment because they were expected to go along and kind of, humour the team and the client and the boss, basically women it came about a little bit because they were second tier in those sorts of environments. They were very male environments. Mainly it was sort of men at the top, and women were basically either there as eye candy or an afterthought. I think that's changed too. You've got more women at the top, and I think that has changed cultures. I mean, I think it's improving in the workplace. That's what I saw. And I think the other thing that I saw actually was probably the shedding light on it, probably through the Me Too movement a bit, also had an effect on good behaviour in the workplace. So if I was to give you, just go back to how I should probably have started this answer, I don't think that workplace sexual harassment is a static thing. I think the workplace has improved in the last 10 years. Not all workplaces are the same. So usually ones with like an advanced HR function and good equality and diversity training and stuff tended to have much less of that. I think when senior men, or I don't always make it about men, but where senior people felt that they might get the opprobrium of their colleagues, and where other senior colleagues wouldn't find that behaviour funny or even tolerate it, that tended to have a sort of effect on behaviours at the top, and also more women in senior roles. So I would say now, and I still practice law, if I was going to do a sexual harassment case sort of today, my expectation when I got the papers that if it would be more likely to take place in a more of an unreconstructed workplace. In fact, the last one that I did was a big construction company where, the woman was one of about 5 against about 500 men. Now, I've made those statistics up, but she was a tiny minority of women. And just that sort of issue wasn't something they ever thought about. But I do think it's going down a bit in the workplace. I definitely saw things change from when I started in practice. I don't think banks, for example, now, the big leading investment banks, would tolerate young or any members, or would openly tolerate members of their team going to a strip club as part of client entertainment. I don't think they would, but they did in 2007. That was really common context in which people would say the harassment had taken place.
Thank you for that really detailed and nuanced answer, Laura. Next, I'm going to combine 2 questions we have from the audience. So first of all, Emma asks, thank you for your question, Emma, do we need more education in schools about consent to try and prevent assault? And then we have an anonymous question which asks, what role do schools in the education system have to play in changing the culture that means harassment is pervasive on the street, in the workplace, and also, of course, it's emerging in schools themselves?
Those are 2 excellent questions, actually. I'm really glad I got asked that, and I should have covered that, I think, when I started. I think, so I did a public forum with some women in my constituency. I let anyone sign up, but it so happened that a lot of the people who did participate were sixth formers at one of the local schools. And I also had some staff who taught sixth form also, actually, at another school. So we ended up having quite a youth focus in the discussion, and we talked quite a lot about what happened in schools. Mainly, some of the things there were about images being circulated and how that ended up and so on. But I think one of the things, and I don't want to sound like Mary Whitehouse or whatever saying this, but one of the things that I think has changed a lot in the last 10 years or so is the availability of porn on phones, and definitely very young people who would have not had certain attitudes developing them, because and it only really takes one person in a group of friends to have a phone and to have parents who don't supervise it or have particularly strict controls and access it, or even someone's older brother or something, and then they're all watching and they're getting this idea, and I think from there you do get into kind of having, you know, like certain attitudes taking hold. And I really think that there is an issue, which I hope that the online harms bill that's coming down the track in this parliament will do a lot more to tackle children, that the availability of that kind of content to children, because I think it sets attitudes. But I also think, and I'm not sure, you know, because I know obviously we're getting into issues of liberty and freedom of choice and so on, I think it also has a corrupting influence on other people who are older, and it also contributes to a sort of very demeaning attitude towards women. And some of the girls on the call, I mentioned this because they said to me that some of the worst kind of grief they got and harassment, and like this curb crawling thing that didn't used to happen, was when they're leaving school, there are like guys in vans who drive up commenting really gross stuff. And they said that they think it's because schoolgirls are depicted a lot in porn, and therefore there's a little bit of a kind of thrill from going to give a shop to sort of 16, 17-year-olds, because they're being, you know, they're able to access it on their phone that night. And I thought there was a really good point there. I think one of the kind of, I thought the teachers actually who appeared in the session that I did were really, really sensitive and respectful. And I thought that they, to be quite honest, were ahead of me in terms of recognising the need for far more open discussions at school, their role in that, the parents' role in that too. And also, I think there's possibly a role for the police, not to scare people, but I think to have a sort of police liaison from your local force come into a sixth form and just talk a little bit about where the boundaries lie, I think is really, really powerful. And one of the things also I would say, which came out of this session and I thought was interesting, is one, I think it was an adult actually said that any parent who is not at least as kind of computer savvy as their own kids in terms of all the apps and stuff is basically neglecting their children, because they're confronted with an awful lot of stuff that can lead into certain attitudes. And it's no longer good enough to just say, you know, I'm a mum, I don't know what they do up in their bedroom all day, because a lot of stuff is happening and it's your responsibility as a parent to know what that is. And I took that quite strongly to heart. My children are very young, but I think there is force in that actually, that parents can't just hand it over to the schools. It starts in the home.
You talking about pornography, and you also mentioned in your speech, we describe as sort of a modern trend of choking, and also where that you recently wrote that you worry that sexual violence, like choking, has become almost normalized. How do you think we got to this point, and do you think porn is at least in part responsible?
Do you know, Phoebe, it's like really, I'm really glad again that you mentioned that, because there was an article, so just after we got the rough sex defence you know, law into the domestic abuse bill, that was last summer, and so there'd been kind of a cross-party piece of work that I'd done with some other MPs, and the government accepted it, so it went into the domestic abuse bill. And about a week later, Men's Health published an article, I think it was on their front page actually, which was how to choke your girlfriend safely. And me and a new Labour MP called Alex Davis-Jones, who also does lots of work in this area, we sort of tweeted about it a bit, and we were like, what a disgrace, you know, every feminist voice in Parliament has been raising this, and we've got a mainstream magazine encouraging men basically to choke their girlfriends. And we both, she and I, so I guess it wasn't too political, got a lot of pushback about how boring we were, and you know, you've got these boring middle-aged politicians trying to tell you how you lived your life. And I have to tell you, some of that came from women too. And I think it shocked me a little bit to think, well, I try not to kind of ladle too much my own view on it, but first of all, I think it starts in porn. Second of all, I think it then becomes not just something that guys do, but something girls do to be sexually desirable, to look as if they're really game and, you know, cool. And then the girls think that that's how they want to be, and they then anyone campaigning on it. But it just struck me that I definitely think that sort of behavior is fueled by what people see. And it's amazing to see how quickly it kind of flips into people who are keen to please, thinking that it's something that unless they're really vocal about, I don't know, maybe I am boring, maybe that's, but I don't know, I was quite surprised that she and I discussed it afterwards, because she had a lot of pushback too about how dare she comment on Men's Health. And the only thing was, I saw that Men's Health did take it down, and Cosmopolitan similarly had a similar article that they got some pushback on, and they took theirs down too. So I don't think it's black and white, and I think we made the right point, because ultimately their editorial team agreed with us, although they never contacted us to say so. But anyway, it was an interesting, weird thing, and I did think that porn played a role in that.
Yeah, it is a very nuanced issue, and I suppose the work of groups like, I guess most prominently, We Can't Consent to This, has been just to draw the line back to consent again and again.
And you know, when you think, I mean, just going back to the issue of rape that we talked about before, that issue of strangulation is such a common overlap. I mean, the woman will say, not only did she not consent to sex, but she'll say, I thought he was going to kill me. I thought he was going to kill me. And the guy says, no, I'm just doing what she wanted me to do. You know, all of it, they're not siloed issues. They're all overlapping issues. And that's, you know, and she says, no, I he didn't just put his hand on my throat for I was out. I was, I thought I was good. That was it. And it's such a dangerous practice, and you can see how in the hands of somebody it's so unbelievably dangerous, and you can see that with it becoming a modern trend, it creates the perfect defense to so many serious sex crimes, because the person can say, perhaps not without any plausibility, I just thought that's what they wanted.
We have a really interesting question from Mariana. Thank you, Mariana, for your question. Are you worried about the increase in the number of women and girls who have turned to OnlyFans in recent years and months?
Yes, I am, but it's almost like just the latest. It's sort of the latest in a sequence of things where I think women get encouraged in a way that is misleading to take themselves into more and more degrading places. In fact, I think some of kind of Instagram and TikTok had begun down that, but it's creating that direct currency. I mean, I watched a really good Channel 4, I don't know if you saw the long Channel 4 kind of piece they did on it, and they did it in the summer, and obviously I guess the lockdown of the pandemic created the perfect storm, particularly when people were short of money for whatever reason, and they had all that time at home. But they had a few women who spoke to Channel 4, and I don't know to what extent they were representative, but their voices were fairly normal, and they sounded that reasonable in the way that they described how they got into it. And they said that they'd kind of begun it with sort of just stuff that didn't feel like a big deal, and then you start to develop people who follow you or who subscribe and who are paying you, and they encourage you to go further and further. And it was very young women who'd got themselves completely out of their depth, and it wasn't possible to say from listening to their stories, and I tried to do it, at what point stuff that they were quite comfortable doing had become stuff they weren't comfortable, although they were very uncomfortable by the time they were talking to the journalist. Their faces were blacked out. She was just interviewing them anonymously. And I think it'd be fair to say it had ruined their lives. And so you have to say, really, it's perhaps like taking a drug. There's not really, but the thing is that there is this sort of, because so many of these things seem to start in what seemed like quite a light way, the woman doesn't think she's getting into some sort of degrading, exploitative thing, and it's legal. And I'm not quite sure yet actually what parliamentarians should do about it. But yes, a good question, and it does worry me.
Yeah, of course, your colleague, Caroline Noakes MP, has criticised the government in the recent months for not doing enough to protect the jobs of women during the pandemic, sort of perhaps accidentally targeting support towards industries that are more male dominated. More female dominated industries have really, seen serious economic hardship. I suppose she might argue that that is what may have contributed to the increased number of women turning to OnlyFans for financial support, as it's been a very, very difficult year for many people. Would you agree with that?
Well, that's a good question, and to be completely honest, I don't have a kind of enough of an empirical knowledge of what the root causes were to be able to answer that clearly. I mean, what I would say about, because I chair Women and work with Jess Phillips, and so we've looked a lot at women's employment. There were 2 or 3 reasons why women lost their jobs. First, part of it was sectoral. There's quite a high number of women who are employed in things like retail, leisure, hospitality, and we know that those industries were hard hit. In many cases, they were furloughed, but not always. There was obviously a lot of redundancy too. Yeah. That hit women because they're disproportionately employed. There was also an issue with women who were already working in insecure, basically more women than men do low paid insecure work, whether that's a 0 hours contract or they're an agency worker or they're a part-time worker. And again, they were more likely to have gone. Some of the jobs that were lost are also the ones that are going to kind of flip back quite quickly. So for example, hospitality is one that's beginning to rebound strongly because people want to get back out there and so places are going to hire. But yes, it is true to say that there were pressure points where women's employment took a big hit. I have to say, I don't know if that sort of was the direct nexus with OnlyFans and the people who, for example, the documentary I watched were students who had, but so I'm afraid I can't say that actually. But I have been working with the government on a strategy for women's employment. So I'm not sure it was quite as linear actually as, they lost a job and went to OnlyFans. I think, they make, like, for example, I think some of them were already influencers. Do you know what I mean? They were already living an online life a bit. And because they couldn't go to locations and so on, they then migrated into a forum what they could do in their bedroom. But as I say, I only really watched one documentary on it with one sample of women who gave their stories, but they were shocking stories. It wasn't something you could just ignore or put down to poor choices, because the choice started off in a fairly anodyne way before it became out of control.
You mentioned the Domestic Abuse Bill, now Act, in your speech. Obviously received royal assent, I think, in April. Yep. Some really positive reforms in that Act. The introduction of a more expansive statutory definition of domestic abuse, a legal duty on local councils to provide safe accommodation for victims.
Yeah.
Recently, during the pandemic, there's been a lot of discussion on how it appears that for some victims, domestic abuse has become much more intense, much more dangerous.
Yeah.
So beyond the Domestic Abuse Act, what other reforms, policies do you want to see introduced in the fight to end domestic abuse over a longer period of time, the next 10, 20 years?
In the fight to end domestic abuse, or in the fight to end sexual violence more broadly?
To end domestic abuse.
So I think that the clue to this, sort of the answer to your question, is in the Court of Appeal's most recent decision on domestic abuse, where they looked at a number of conjoined appeals. All of them were around coercive control, but there was another issue that was rippling beneath the surface, which is, do judges handle domestic abuse cases right? Do victims get justice? And it was put that there is mishandling, there is insensitivity, there is a failure to understand how varied domestic abuse is. And there was an argument in Parliament actually about whether or not the Secretary of State, whether the Lord Chancellor should take responsibility for training judges and training juries, or whether that should fall within the Judicial College. In a way, it doesn't particularly matter, but I do think that we won't properly resolve domestic abuse until we have a better system of justice for it. And I do think overall there needs to be an improvement in training. And one of the other things that the Court of Appeal actually said in their decision on that case, because they were confronted with some lapses by judges, is that where training was very good in an area of domestic abuse, they saw very little in the way of appeals coming to them. And it was only where the training was more patchy or not of a high enough quality that they were confronted with like cases like the one they had to determine. So I think there's an important need for judicial training and police training actually too. The thing about the police, it's difficult. I mean, I only know because I sort of speak to local forces. they're always very confident that they do have a very good grasp of domestic abuse. You know, it's not like when you raise it, it's not like it's something they haven't heard of, but it's difficult to know if that's exactly the victim's experience too. And unless, I mean, I have one or two constituents who've come to me with that, but I don't have a profound overview of what every single domestic abuse complainant, what their experience is in the police. And so I think it would be fair to say I'm alive possibly to the need for better training in that police level too, without having any knowledge, particularly, you know, one way or the other. But
yeah, so I mean, I guess you've spoken about the sort of the mishandling of cases, a need to train judges and juries. Also mentioned the Ask for Annie program, which is obviously really important in terms of it, you know, getting victims to safety as soon as possible. But do we do enough to long-term stop cycles of violence? I mean, we don't have perpetrator programs in the UK, for example, which is something that some other countries have internationally. I mean, is that something you'd like to see change?
That's a really good point, Phoebe, actually. And I think I'm right in saying that there are some forms of perpetrator program, because I do recall that being raised in Parliament. But the fact that I can't give you a good answer on that is either a sign that I wasn't listening hard enough, or the fact that they're so kind of nascent and new that they don't have the kind of traction that that mean that they're widespread enough. And I'm not confident, actually. A lot of people would say that there is a lot of perpetrator training. And I think you're right, actually, to say that that is an area where there is room for improvement. And I don't know, I have to be completely honest with you, I don't know to what extent domestic abuse has increased or decreased. I mean, I can remember when I was a young kid, you know, one of my friends' mums had a violent husband, and back in those days it would just be like something that other parents wouldn't want to mention too much because they were having a domestic, and that was rare because it was semi-visible. But I think there's always been, in a small minority of relationships, you know, there's been either violence or very, very poor treatment. And I think the only thing that's probably changed it to an extent is the economic freedom of women, because back in the 50s and 60s, the woman basically didn't walk away because she was, you know, economically powerless. One of the things, I don't think it necessarily stops the domestic abuse, but the fact that women, you know, are not housewives to the extent that they were, does mean that people can leave in a way, not, of course, not every relationship, but in some relationships, there's an exit route that didn't used to exist.
Well, Laura, I mean, thank you so much for your time this evening. I mean, I feel like we've touched on a lot of really difficult issues. It's fantastic to get insight into the work you're doing to address these things long term, and fantastic to hear as well that you're having so many conversations with victims and also young women who are experiencing these things and dealing with them every day. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much to the audience for watching and for sending in excellent questions.
Thank you, Phoebe. And yeah, also it's good to be pushed and to have to think about things that I definitely don't have all the answers to. And I hope this is part of the continuing conversation, and, you know, that will evolve through the life of this Parliament and beyond.
Fantastic. Thank you, Laura.
My pleasure.